and I don't need a show of hands to know who can learn from and be held up by the bold story of Darnell L. Moore, an award-winning writer, a leading Black Lives Activist Matter, an advocate for justice and liberation, because we can all learn from him, and Oprah thinks so too. In his brave and beautifully written book, No Ashes in the Fire, which O has just named a top book of the summer, Darnell shares the journey taken by a scared, bullied teenager in Camden, New Jersey, who not only survived but found his calling to LGBTQ activism and Black joy through faith and family. His transcendence over the myriad forces of repression that faced him from the state, its police force, its educational institutions, its leaders, the corporate class, and his own fears is a triumph. We're doubly blessed to have in the store tonight Clint Smith, a writer, a PhD candidate at Harvard University, and the author of Counting Descent, a tightly woven collection of haunting lyrical poems, who will be in conversation with Darnell tonight. Please join me in welcoming Clint Smith and Darnell L. Moore.
How's everybody doing this evening? Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming out. I know you could be anywhere in the world, mostly watching Netflix, but you're here with us, and we appreciate it. So I am thrilled to be here. I am a long-time admirer of Darnell, and it's one of those, what do they say? It's like a long-time listener, first-time caller. So this is the first time we've been able to be in conversation with one another, and I'm deeply grateful for that. And I think the first thing I have to ask you is, was it today that you found out about Oprah magazine? Like, how does it feel to have been touched by the Queen?
By the Holy Ghost. No, I found out some time ago. I just couldn't say anything, but it's included in their top summer picks. And I was explaining to Clint in the back and Heidi that my mom is very excited. And she gets, so I'm like, oh, Mom, I had a really good review on Book Forum. And she's like, okay. And I'm like, Mom, this thing is on Oprah's list. She's like, oh, shit, you done made it now. So it's a blessing that that the book is resonating with people. It just feels really, really nice. And I'm honored, really.
So about the book, one of the things that I loved most about this book, among many things, is the way, we talked about this a little bit in the back, but the way in which you are sort of grounding a lot of sociology, a lot of history, a lot of political and social history into the sort of stories that are specific to you and specific to your family and specific to those in your community, and specifically thinking about those in Camden. And I'm thinking about the way you talk about environmental racism and ground it in, or the way you talk about how Camden smelled growing up, and then ground that in an analysis of environmental racism, or the way you talk about your father's imprisonment and ground that in a sort of larger analysis of mass incarceration, or where you talk about the negative equity that your grandmother's house accrued, and put that in conversation with the larger social phenomenon of housing segregation and discrimination. And so I'm wondering how you thought about the sort of interweaving of the historical and the personal as you put this collection together.
Yeah, so I should admit that I did not intend to write a memoir, and I explained in the back because I just felt, memoir is so grandiose and so narcissistic in a way. And I also was like, well, why am I writing a memoir? What did I do? I haven't done anything. Like, this is because I didn't have an understanding of memoir as a form, and appreciate memoir as a genre that uses narrative to do this type of work that theory can do or attempts to do. So it was really it was important for me, though, to ground my stories or my sort of experiences in a larger framework. Like, I could have wrote a chapter about Camden and described by virtue of by way of narrative how my streets looked like a war zone in some instances. How streets in Camden, where I grew up, had so many dilapidated homes without windows, some of them boarded up, and left the reader to imagine this quote-unquote hood without giving the reader a context to how Camden became ghettoized. And that means letting the reader, letting all of us, letting systems off the hook. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want folk to look at this and like, oh, here's a little Negro that was from the hood who was exceptional. He was smart and he made it out. You can do it too, black person. Pull yourself up by the bootstrap. I wanted to say to the reader, no, if Camden is the way it is, if it's a city that has suffered, and you're looking at what happens when a post-industrial city has suffered because of political malfeasance, because of things like folk removing themselves from cities when people too brown and too black move in, because of media narratives. I wanted folk to know, like, Camden is what it is because it was made that way. It was constructed. Things had happened to bring Camden to what it is, and so many of our hands have been involved in the making of Camden. As an example, with this notion of how narrative can be used to raise a point about environmental racism, I literally say in a book that my street smelled like shit. And imagine leaving your house every day as a kid and all you smell is literally shit. I did not know, and pardon me if I'm offending some of you with the word I'm using here, but I'm just going to give it to you like I wrote it. Part of what would happen is I would walk outside and smell what would smell like the bathroom of so many people's homes. No one ever told me that laws had been sort of passed and regulations had been allowed that allowed suburban neighborhoods to ship all of their feces to the municipal plant on my block in the neighborhood that I lived. That is a story about a neighborhood smelling like something nasty, but it's also a story about environmental racism, or how policies are constructed outside of our watch, under our nose, leaving kids in a neighborhood that smells like that to be widely susceptible to things like asthma and so much else, which is the case now. So I try to do that by painting this, by drawing out a narrative that can, without me ever having to use the word environmental racism, hopefully by the time you read it, you'll understand what it means.
In thinking about that, part of what's interesting about a memoir is this idea that you are looking back at a period in your life with a different lens than you understandably and necessarily had at that time in your life. And so I'm curious what it was like to write a book in a moment in which you have a certain set of political sensibilities that you may not necessarily have had at the time you were experiencing the things you're describing, right? So what it means to be a 10-year-old walking through, a block that smells like feces, you don't necessarily have, I imagine, unless, you're an exceptional dude, so maybe you did have it. I didn't have it. But like, what does it mean to walk through a block that smells like feces without having the language with which to name that, or without having the history with which to associate where that's coming from? And I think, when I'm thinking about my own childhood, I grew up in New Orleans, right? And for so long, New Orleans was called the murder capital of the nation. People were talking about black on black crime. And I had a sort of, I was very frustrated with these things. I knew that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. I was very confused by the sort of language people were using to sort of pathologize my community, but I didn't know how to describe that. Yeah. I didn't have the intellectual toolkit with which to push back against that. And so I'm curious how one manages to again write a book, again knowing all of the things that you know, reading all of the things that you've read, without imposing that on the 10-year-old or 15-year-old or 20-year-old version of yourself, because you didn't necessarily you may not have known that then. And how do you find the balance between being honest in one's reflection, or how your assessment of things at that time and your assessment of them now?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I really did try to write as best I could the interior life of a self in time. Certainly, I would not have used the term environmental racism at 10 years old. What I would have said is smells. And what I try to do there is to get this point across that there's often this idea that, black people growing up in certain parts of the country, in certain spaces, without access to certain types of language, are certain, who's not talking to the choir, if they're not using the word intersectionality, somehow lack analysis. And what I wanted to be clear about is, even if I didn't have all the language down, I did sense that some things were wrong. I sensed that. You know how I knew things were wrong? Because when I would bus myself 4:30 in the morning from Camden to Mullica Hills by virtue of 2 buses over the course of 2 hours, and I saw neighborhoods change. This is what I write, that, you know, I wasn't able to talk about like political neglect or economic disenfranchisement. I had no sense of what that terms meant. But I would drive on a bus at 14 for 2 hours, looking at how the neighborhoods looked different as I got closer and closer to the private school I went to. Mullica Hills Friends School is the school I went to. And I would just sit there and like, this is different. I don't see all this, the trash on the streets. The roads are wider. You know, I went to a school where people were getting dropped off. One time somebody came to school, got dropped off in a limo, and I was just like, this is vastly different. You know what I'm saying? Like, a limo. So that was 14 at the time. I had a clear awareness. I could see and sort of gauge the differences and things that were going on, the class differences, even though I would not call it class. That's what I try to write or narrate in the narrativize in the text to the best of my ability.
And to a point you brought up before, you make a conscious effort throughout the text to, at every opportunity in which someone could say, wow, Darnell is just like an exceptional person. Darnell just like had something in him that allowed him to transcend a certain set of barriers and limited opportunities for social mobility. If only we could just give all of the little black kids the sort of grit that that Darnell had, and to sort of move beyond these things that are otherwise holding him back. You push back against that vehemently throughout the text. And can you talk about why that's so important?
It's so important because I know what can happen if we write stories that are about like individual triumph and ascent, or that seem to hint at that. You know, I know how a book like that can be used, and what will be done is you take that, and I'm a teacher, you take that back into the classroom and you say, well, this person right here did it. He got up every day after his parents were fighting in the home. He went to schools that were you know, under-resourced. He got beat up and called names on the street, but he still got back up and got A's on his report card. The danger of that type of individualized narrative is it happens so much. What that does, I have a friend, Amy Cox, who's a cultural anthropologist, who talks about the danger of relying on this notion of resiliency for black young people. Resiliency hints at the ability for black young people to constantly get back up after something has knocked them down. And by saying resilient, what you point to is the strength of that young person without ever pointing to the thing that's knocking them the hell down over and over and over again. What I wanted to do is say, listen, I don't care how much smarts you got. I don't care how much pizzazz and strength you may think you have. Sometimes fires, we are consumed, some of us, by fires that people set. Some of us don't make it out of that. And I know some very, very smart people who deserve to be alive right now. So if smarts and intellect and the ability to pull yourself up by the bootstrap was the determining factor, then they would not be buried. And that's what I want people to get. You understand that this is not about some exceptional, look, I had a lot of people around me. I had the grace of the ancestors and so many forces that conspired to allow me to be here. But that is not the case for a lot of folk. And reading the story in that way, I think, does not allow us to see how each of us can be implicated. Not only in the demise of others, but our silences too. The expectation that young black folk ought to sort of walk down the street, that y'all should just be out here be like this one, be like Coates, be like Clint Smith, be like any of these exceptional Negroes, right? One, we're not exceptional. And, we're not exceptional. That's the one thing, right? And I think all of the writers I just named do work at attempting to sort of knock that sort of idea out of the water. But what's the only thing that's most exceptional, I think, where the strength of black folk is such a mundane thing that we are here, is the most, that strength What's exceptional is the sort of mundaneness of the very types of everyday oppressions that folk go through that are normalized and people ignore. And that's what I wanted to point out. I get a little preachy. So I'm like a preacher in a church. I need you sometimes to talk back to me. You don't have to look at me like I'm going in, because I know. You hear me, though? Okay. Well, you hear me? Because y'all look. I was looking like, don't make me get church up in here. All right. Because I come from the type where I know y'all hear what I'm talking about. You can look at me like I'm crazy all you want, but I know y'all hear what I'm talking about.
I had to stop myself from getting up. I was like, but that's so interesting, right? And I think about how that idea has been present throughout the history of Black folks in this country, right? I think about the slave narratives, and I think about how slave narratives were intended to kind of singularly be used as a means of illuminating the experience of how enslaved people were treated and how cruel antebellum slavery was, and in many ways it did. But to your point about the sort of insidious ways in which these texts and these narratives can be used, there were so many people who used Frederick Douglass's story, or used Olaudah Equiano's story, or used Phyllis Wheatley, and instead of saying, "Wow, look at how this writing illuminates the horrific nature of this structure under which they are operating," people would then say, "Well, why can't people be more like Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass beat his master up and escaped. Why can't everybody else do that?"
You're a good poet, like
right? Exactly. Why? Phyllis Wheatley's out here winning prizes. What do you got? So it's so interesting the ways in which even Black exceptionalism becomes punished, right? Like in ways that white folks just never have to concern themselves with. A white person can write a book about being exceptional. It's like, look at this exceptional white person, right? But a Black person does that, or somebody existing on the margin of an oppressed community, and it becomes used as a means to delegitimize, or instead to legitimize the existence of the structures in place. Yes. As they exist currently, right? And saying, you have to be able to point to a Darnell, or point to an Obama, or point to an Oprah, and say, well, they made it. Well, why can't everybody else? And I think about how that's been so pervasive over the course of, since 1619, since the first Black folks were brought here. Another thing that I found so fascinating about the book is that, like, I really, and sometimes people say this and they just say it because it's the only Black writer they know, but I really felt a lot of Baldwin in here. And specifically, I'm thinking about, you write a lot about your relationship to the church and your relationship to faith. And it's a complicated relationship. It's a tenuous sometimes relationship, a complex relationship. And you struggle with many of the same features and facets of both organized religion and spirituality more broadly, in a way that I find to be similar to how Baldwin expressed some of the things that he was wrestling with in his faith. So were you thinking about that at all? And I guess I'm curious how Baldwin, if he does, how he informs your work and your thinking around these things.
Sure, I think Baldwin certainly ghosts so much of my work. And I just actually had a interview about Baldwin's influence. But I don't know if I was thinking necessarily about Baldwin's sort of approach to spirituality in the church while I was writing. I kept thinking about the strange relationship that the church, I grew up in a Black church, so I'll be more specific about my experience with the Black church, and as someone who was in ministry in a Black church, the ways in which the Black church and theologies have shaped so much of our understanding of self. Not only how it shaped our understanding of manhood and womanhood, of our sexuate selves, as our identities, our sexual expressions, but our senses of self. So much. To be very clear, I suffered a long bout of depression, and depression that pushed me to the borders of living. Like, I ideated about suicide and I attempted it. And a lot of that had to do with what had been preached behind the pulpits that I too stood behind to preach. And this is an interesting Baldwin connection. Pulpits that I had internalized the idea of these sort of, I often talk about theologies that kill, theologies that heal. These violent theologies I internalized, and I was actually preaching out of my mouth words that were vile and hurtful to me. Ain't that something? That I loved a God image, a God idea, more than I loved myself, to the point that I was willing to take myself out of here and tried for the sake of appeasing that God idea that had been constructed by some other folk. So I really wanted to illuminate that. I know too many people and counsel them, have been in community with them, who could not look in the mirror and see themselves and love the self that was looking back, because they still believe the God that had been given to them in somebody's sermon hate them and want them to go to hell. So if your lot is hell, which really becomes the sort of presence of, or sort of the lives you get to live here on earth, what's the point in being here is a question so many people ask. It's the question I ask, and I wanted to put that on paper so that someone who is in a situation where they somehow are loving the God they can't see, but loving the self that they can, or not loving the self they can sort of switch that up a bit. Because it's these theologies have been deadly. I will note though, a big part of my understanding of this comes, I should say I trained in seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary, and James Cone, who is passed, was one of the forces that helped to shape and reshape my theology. So Black liberation theology, womenist theologies especially, feminist theologies were essential to me saving myself. I actually left the institutional church when I got in seminary. Isn't that funny? It was so funny. I remember this, just as a side, in order to finish, they're supposed to send you out to do supervised ministry in the church. And I complain. I'm like, I'm not going to a church. But they were, well, why are you in a seminary? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I liked the church when I got here. I don't like the church no more. So send me to. I actually came to D.C. and worked as a researcher in a very I'm not going to say the name, a very conservative public policy institute whose frame was all about the faith-based initiative at the time. But it was leaving the institutional church in that way within a very conservative theological seminary was one of the most freeing things I could ever done, and absolutely shaped and reframed how I thought about spirituality in the church.
Was there a book, I've heard you talk about how one of the reasons you wrote this book, it's kind of that old Toni Morrison adage, if there is not a book that, or if there's a book, I'm paraphrasing, but if there's a book that hasn't been written and you feel like it needs to be, someone needs to read it, then you should write it. And you've alluded to that in other interviews that I've seen you do. And I'm curious if there was a book that you found that was, like, what was there a book that was important for you that was trying to do the sort of work that you are trying to do in this book, or was there not?
Zombie by Audre Lorde. It's so good. First of all, the writing is just stellar. It's so good. Oh gosh. But it is, Lorde calls it an automyth biography. Something that it's a mixture of sort of like autobiography, mythology, ethnography, where she is trying to repurpose or reimagine what form could look like in terms of how one narrates their life story. And she deviates from, it isn't a strict memoir or a chronological autobiography. It's a sort of composite of a range of different forms, and it's beautiful words. So Audre Lorde's work was crucial in what it meant to put Black queer life on paper. I read a lot of Black feminist works, Cheryl Clark's poetry and June Jordan's essays and Jackie Alexander's The Crossings, or all of these, the styles, what they're sort of trying to get at in terms of form were really crucial to me. But then the words of Essex Hemphill and Joseph Beam were vital. Joseph Beam grew up 10 minutes away from me in Philly. I was in Camden. So their works too. And the last were a group called Other Countries. And I'm so glad to name them in this space because they're rarely talked about. But Other Countries was a collective of Black, gay, bi, men, some women as well, who would write together in collectivities and review each other's work in New York, and then they would publish them together. How many of y'all heard of them? No one, right? But they've been publishing books since like the 80s. And it isn't that their works are like to be celebrated because they're like black and queer. It's like actually good ass writing. It's like literature that, had it wholly been recognized in the canon, could have made some really critical interventions in how we think about African American literature and form. So those are writings that certainly shaped the book and have had an influence on me.
And who are some writers that are writing today who you think are writing into that missing place in the canon?
Oh yeah, so many. Ricky Laurentis, Alexis Pauline Gumbs is essential reads. She just published a few books through Duke University Press that everyone should be reading. Mecca Jamila Sullivan is a writer who writes black lesbian women's lives in such a pivotal way. Writers that are coming up, Hari Zayed is working on a book that they are about to produce, George Johnson. Michael Arsenault's book is coming out, I Can't Date Jesus. There are so many writers who are attempting.
What a title.
Isn't that amazing? It's coming out in July. And these writers, so it's one thing to already to write about Black life within an industry that has a particular understanding about what those types of books ought to look like, one that's not overly represented with our works. It's another thing to also attempt to then write Black life with the queer slant, or with a slant that removes it from the ways that we come to otherwise imagine Black life ought to be written, maybe by cisgender heterosexual men. So here we have folk who are writing, often not really receiving the same types of support, who are about to have books out on trade presses, which is not to say that we have not had this before, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be writing in conversation with them and to say, here are voices, our stories, our narratives that absolutely need to be told too, and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that they are.
Definitely. I've got a couple more questions before I want to make sure we have time to open it up. But one of the things I also love so much about this book is the ways in which
if Clint Smith says he likes the book, y'all, like that's a big deal. Like, do you know, he's like a big deal, you know?
You're very kind. I'm thinking about I think so much of sometimes what happens when Black folks and Black folks who have a certain set of political commitments, or any person with a certain set of political commitments, is writing into a space in which they are trying to push back against centuries of pathology, of dehumanization, of degradation. What can happen, and I'm speaking to this largely through things I've read, but also through personal experience. So I've worked in prisons for the last 5 years, and when I first started working in prisons, when I was writing about them, so much of what I had been told through the media, directly or indirectly, about life in prisons were that, you know, these caricatures, these monsters, these terrible people who've done terrible things, and they deserve to be there, and we shouldn't have any sort of empathy for them at all. You start working in a prison, or you start developing relationships with people who are said monsters in the sort of larger public discourse, and you realize how wrong that is. You realize how misguided that is. And part of what I did was you almost try to swing the pendulum to the other side. And so instead of, you know, when the caricature is all the people in prison are dumb and violent and incapable of anything that necessitates any sort of intellectual capacity, then, you know, I swing to the other side and I start talking about how, like, everybody in prison loves Kant and Malcolm X, and, you know, we were reading Hegel yesterday and it was great, which isn't true, right? There's certainly some people like that, but I think I found myself trying so hard to convince folks to see these people as human that I almost made them less human just on the other side. And part of what I really appreciate about your book is that you wrestle with the complexities of people you love, right? Like, you see, like, you are able to name the things that make them worthy of empathy and compassion, and also talk about your profound disappointment in them. And in this sense, I'm thinking specifically about your father, and trying to say this person was emotionally harmful to me. This person was neglected me, but also and saying that the impact that had on you was very real, while also trying to place your relationship with him in, again, a larger social and historical context to say, let me try to understand the reasons why this person would treat me this way, and to see it as part of a sort of larger pattern of institutional neglect rather than simply a sort of personal neglect that was singularly between you two.
So my dad, so I would love to think that I would have struggled with his complexity anyway, but that would be a lie. My dad passed while I was writing the book when I started writing it, and he was only 55. I had a very fraught relationship with him for a lot of different reasons. And so I think I might have been on a second chapter or something, and I was called home to go see him. And just to give you a sense of how much I disliked him and loved him at the same time, I would always say to people, if he dies, I don't know what I'm going to say at his funeral. I'm like his only son, the oldest of the 4 kids. And you know that patriarchal stuff where they're like, well, you're going to be the one that got to speak and all that shit. And I was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to say because I don't really have anything nice to say. But when he passed, 2 things happened that really changed the way, that forced me to think deeply about my political commitments and how I was practicing what I had been preaching. One, about the disposability of Black people, and how we can't really do to each, we just cannot do to each other what the system does to us. We come into the world that easily wants to take us in and spit us out. We can't do that to one another. And about love, radical love. So 2 things happened. On his deathbed, my sisters and I surrounded him, and he was unconscious. And all I kept meditating on was how heavy this sort of room felt, how heavy he looked. A lot of that heaviness, I assume, had to do with the fact that he had not asking us for our forgiveness. He carried a lot of guilt, which I believe was part of the reason why he kept himself away from at least me anyway, and my sisters, but he's really close to the younger sister. So around this bed, we grab hands, and I say out loud, I know that you're heavy, and I know that you're carrying a lot of weights, and I want you to let them go and fly. And he passed. And it changed me. Because when I was talking to my mom, my mom had been the recipient of the violence, mostly. I vicariously. But when I went to her and I said, so what do you think about this? How do you feel about him? I didn't like him for so long. She was like, you know what? And this is a man that tried to kill her. She's like, I've known him since he was a kid. We've been friends since we were kids. By the way, he had me at 15. It did not hit me that he was 15 years old until I wrote the sentence down in the book. Like, I knew it. But, like, it hit me. Like, wait. He was 15 years old. He didn't finish 8th grade. And he had a kid. Who taught him what he knew about being a Black boy, becoming a man? Who taught him what he knew about fatherhood? But my mom turned to me and said, you've seen a lot of I got to see a full picture of him, and I didn't just see the bad. So the person that who did all of this wrong was also the same person that tried to save me when I was almost sexually assaulted and slept in my backyard every day to make sure I was okay. When I didn't have food, she was 16. When I didn't have food, he would go steal it. Don't tell nobody he stole it. And make sure I ate. And she humanized him. And that's why she's been at peace for so long and was able to love him as he transitioned. And that lesson, his death, made me rewrite. Like, I had to approach the book in a different way. And it made me think about human complexity. Not only his, but also mine. So, I can't, in the book I say I'm an ellipsis of my father. Like, I am him. It's easy to lift him up as the big bad guy in the room and not wrestle with the big badness in me too. And I'm so grateful that that work was done. So he may not know it. Well, he knows it now, but he did teach me a valuable lesson in life that changed my life, and taught me, this is a person who I learned to hate, how to learn to love again, and to love him again. I even dedicated the book to him. He was one of the people. That's a big deal. For real. He should be real happy. But I'm a changed person because of him. And I use my relationship with my father, and I talk in one moment about reflecting on how beautiful his hands was when he washed me as a boy in a bathtub, and those same hands that he used to wash me were used to do damage too. But they were both beautiful and profane, not one or the other. And that to me is what it means to be human, which doesn't exonerate us from what we do, of the wrongs that we do. It is to say, though, I can look at him and see a whole person who can be held accountable, but who can also be loved.
And this is the last thing I'll ask. Sort of a bigger picture question. So much, we're in this moment with Me Too and Time's Up, but so much of the framing and so much of the discussion is in a sort of heterosexual framework. And I'm curious how you think about what it looks like to have honest and thoughtful and kind of precise conversation about the ways in which sexual violence manifests itself in relationships that are not heterosexual, and how, because it is in a same-sex relationship, the aesthetics of the power dynamic are not as obvious in the same way. And so I'm curious how you think about what it looks like to be able to discuss that in ways that feel generative and productive.
Yeah, so while the optics of the relationships may look totally different, right? So in heteronormative or heterosexual relationships as a man and a woman, which obviously makes you think about sort of male domination, sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, male power, and the denial and subjugation of women and womanhood and femininity. The basis of homophobia or homo antagonism is deeply deep. It's all connected to a sort of disdain of the femme. It's sexist. So let me give an example. Like, you know, when gay men, for example, or however same gender loving, queer, however identified, talk about tops and bottoms, the formulation is such that tops are often perceived as the giver, the doer, the one with power, and sorry if this is stretching your imagination to y'all think about some other stuff here. And the bottom is often held up as the receiver, as the person who. So here's the formulation is such that it's top and bottom, power, sort of submissive. Do you see this construction is a sexist framework here? At the core of it is still a real deep sort of a deep denial and sort of subjugation of femme energy, of femininity, of womanhood, of the essence that is the femme. Those things are the same. But here's the thing, like I'm really clear, and I try to do this in the book too, sexual assault, intimate partner violence are real factors in same-sex relationships and queer relationships. They just are. And part of, because they've been talked about in such a heteronormative way, one, there isn't a lot of space for folk to name that. And then the dynamic of, I also know that I have folk who've called law enforcement, unfortunately, when instances happen. And you know what's been said to like a guy who calls to get help because another guy has assaulted him? What you would do? What the hell I'm doing? Like, I've had people say that. Like, this is what the police said. Or they were supposed to come to help, but by the time they were done, so much homophobic shit had been said that the reason they were supposed to be there was never solved. But sexual violence also happens. So many queer and trans folk, gender non-conforming folk have been victims of sexual assault and sexual violence, and absolutely some have perpetrated those things too, and we have to name that. But getting back to the point about not letting myself off the hook, I examine the extent to which sexism and patriarchy shapes me. I examine the extent to which I am complicit in that as a cisgender man. Like I want to name that and hold myself accountable. But I think we have a lot of work to do in ensuring that the Me Too conversation is expanded so that it includes the narratives of so many other folk as well.
So we have some time for questions from the audience. So there is a mic here and there is a mic here. Please feel free to come ask a question. Please make sure it is a question. And please make sure that you are thoughtful and give enough time for folks to have time to ask their question after you. We were both teachers, so we know about wait time.
You know I was about to say it, right?
Brief question about, I'm just really pleased to hear you speaking. This is really rewarding to me. But your dad, do you relate to your dad? Do you look like your dad? You have wonderful hands. You were describing his hands washing you, that image of me. And I thought, are you looking down at your own hands and saying, that was like my dad's?
That's such a good question. Certainly, I think, do I look like him? Yeah, I think I do. I mean, my hair is starting to recede like his. So I'm
Welcome
like,
to the club,
I'm
man.
so mad at, I'm like, damn, why I had to get that damn trait? Shit. I'm doing okay though. I mean, but he was super loving. Mm-hmm. He really was very generous, and really fun, and he loved clothes. Those are traits that I got from him.
You got that from him.
Certainly, and I do relate to him. Part of the reason why I think my disdain was so thick is because I had admired him so. We were vastly different. So his nickname, we grew up in Camden. It's like the hood, they call it the hood, and this is important for me to say because he's very cool, like the cool cat that they called Sweet Daddy. That was his nickname. Sweet Daddy. I don't want to know why he got that name. And Graf. So imagine Sweet Daddy, Graf, walking with his little nerdy. I used to wear big glasses, very skinny, and I used to wear like church clothes. He would be walking with me down the street like with a bop. And they're like, yo, Sweet Daddy Graf, what's good? And he's like, yo, y'all see my son? And I'm like a little nerd. Like, so we could not have been too
Really
different. But our spirits were very much the same, and he loved me a lot. So I do, I have a strong connection and relation to him.
Was he a storyteller? Did he tell you stories about himself or his family?
No, but my grandfather was. My grandfather, who also was my mom's dad, who was a central figure in my life, a father figure who pretty much raised me. Like I slept in a bed with him and my grandmom until I was 10. He's the one that after I snuck myself and lied to get myself in a private school, made sure that I was taken care of, took care of me when I was in college. He was a poet. And a couple things I found when we buried him was not only the suit, because he was so together. Like he left the suit with the suit that he wanted to wear when he passed with a note and it said, "I'm wearing this suit. These are the Bible scriptures you're going to read." But I also found his book that had poems in them. And that moved me so much because people would always say, that's the person that they say, you look just like your grandfather. You're just like him. You're an artist. But I never was able to sort of see the connection until I read his words. One
last thought. How did your dad feel about your success, seeing you growing up and becoming...
He was very proud. He was very proud. I mean, when I would see him, he would brag. And my uncles, his brothers, who I'm very close to, they write me all the time, even now, and say things like, your dad was so proud of you. I believe his inability to say that had everything to do with the guilt he carried. But they would always say, he'd be watching you through our Facebook page. I'm like, well, tell his ass he need to say something. Like, you can... You watching, but you ain't speaking for, you know. But every time I would see him, he always was super proud. And bragged all the time, even when he didn't know to get the facts straight. He'd be like, Darnell done went and got. I'm like, no, that's not the degree I got, but it's whatever. I mean, I did graduate. You know what I'm saying? So I'll let you get that, but you wrong. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's big. Thanks.
Hey, Big Ed.
Hi.
So I have two questions. You spoke about your political commitments. Do you have any political aspirations yet?
No, I used to, but when I decided that I am unable to lie, that's when I'm like, I can't lie, so I can't be a politician. And I only say that as someone who works very closely with politicians. I'm sorry if there's any sorry y'all, but like, you know, it requires some nuanced truth telling. I'll just say facts. That. So yeah, no political office for me. I don't think I'll make it very far after I'm finished on the dais. They'd probably be like, please do not let him in anybody's.
And you talk about that in the book. You talk about like working with certain politicians and the ways, like how you came in, almost thinking about progressivism through one lens, and you were like, oh, I'm doing this work on behalf of these people, and these people were like, nah, you're not. Right. You're not doing that on behalf of us.
Exactly.
Which I imagine was like a profound learning experience.
It was a profound learning experience. I was in community and it was like, oh no, son, we're going to hold you accountable. So no political aspirations for me. I think the best work I can do is support those who have that aspiration, and to provide them with as much support and accountability as possible, but I can't do it. No.
My second question was, did Keith Boykin apologize personally for his comments?
So one of the things that I he did.
Okay.
He did apologize. I won't go any more further than that.
You don't get any context?
So what I will say is this, and I'm going to, you know, I know how to sort of respond to tough questions with artful responses.
I know you do.
At the end of the book, in the book, I tell the story about OB, who was the young boy that took a gallon of gasoline and poured it on me and tried to light the match. And I go through a lot of, I did a lot of work to humanize OB. Some people said, well, what? Some people said to me, asked me today, well, what happened to the young people? Like, were they punished? What, did he go to jail? I think then I would have wanted OB to go to jail. But because I changed so much between the 14-year-old self and the old 42-year-old self that I am now, older, mature, who learned some things about life and learned some things about justice. By the end of the book, I had been searching for OB online because I wanted to make sure that, one, he was alive. Like, I literally was like searching death record, like all types of spaces to make sure that this young boy was alive, that he wasn't incarcerated, that he was well. And part of that had to do with my belief that punishment and retribution don't change folks' behaviors, ideologies, spirits. Jail ain't going to keep him from being like homo antagonistic or not wanting to set somebody on fire. But it's a sort of space where folk can be held account, and can grow from can. So to go back to the question that you asked, you know, like, he apologized, and it never was my point to see him attacked either. You know what I'm saying? Like, you sort of, when you write something like that, you set yourself up for that without me having to do anything.
Yeah.
But I think so much is the case within a moment like this where retribution and punishment becomes the end goal. And what I'm asking, what is the end goal then for us? And if it's transformative justice, what might that look like beyond beyond jail, beyond call out, which sometimes is necessary, and some of these other things that we think is justice, but only hints doesn't even get us close to the type of transformation that we need. Does that make sense? Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. We'll always wonder what Keith Boykin said, but But you took the high road. It's okay though. Yeah, there he is.
I learned from some of the best, trust me.
Good evening, greetings.
Hi.
Good sir. So just wrapped up second year of divinity school, right? One more year to go. And I think that this second year has been really characterized by a lot of work, internal work, right? Tonight, you've put so much of yourself kind of on display, right? This stunning degree of vulnerability. And I would love if you could kind of walk us through your process, the work, right, that you had to kind of like internally do to be able to even get to the point where you could put something like that, not only on paper, right, but now to be on this book tour and be in front of so many folks. Like, what did your vulnerability work process look? And right, to build on that last question, what did your work in terms of forgiveness look like so that you could actually be present with your own story and the stories of others?
Yes, so you all should know I'm an introvert, and it takes a lot of energy to not only sit before crowds, but to also sort of bear myself so vulnerably. But part of what I have learned to do is to look, I've come from like a type of family where so much of our secrets we just hold in. Like, I sit there sometimes like, we all saw and experienced the same thing, right? Like, there were things that happened that we probably should state harmed us, hurt us. We are hurting. And it was a type of thing where you can even feel the heaviness sometimes, but no one ever named it. And as someone, so I also didn't, and I also went to school to study to become a therapist. So I got a degree in clinical counseling. So this has also something to do. I mean, I've kind of been trained to think this way. So for me to write this out was also my way of saying we don't have to stay locked in these sort of closets with our shames, because it's in those spaces where we get so overwhelmed, so overcome and burdened by the pains that we can't really find freedom. So when I gave the manuscript to my mom, bless her heart, she said a couple things to me. She's like, I'm reading this very slowly. That's the first thing. She said, some of the things I just had to cover my eyes, She's like, it's a bit much. I didn't need to know all about your sex life. But so many of the things, Darnell, that you said about me, I had forgotten. And that was interesting to me because those are very vivid memories in my mind. Very vivid memories of watching her suffer physical abuse. But that's what trauma does. We learn as a coping mechanism to build walls so that we don't have to really sit with and watch and observe the past pains that we've carried. And she told me how much it helped her. My sister said, she would write me every chapter I would send her a chapter every time I'm done. She was like, I'm crying again. You make me sick. And one day she called me up and said, I've been holding this in for so long. She's 38. It took her 38 years to share a secret. And she wept. So I kept thinking, like, maybe this can be an example for us. One, to say, I don't have to hold on to this pain. That my healing comes by actually saying, here it is. I offer it up, to whoever, to the spirit to take it away, to my family, to the collective, but I don't have to hold it. And that is how I got healed. Like, yeah, I do feel the type of way that like people are like, folk are already reading this all over the place, but you know what? I'm good. Like, when I finished writing, I was a different person. Like, I literally didn't have a lot of the weights that I was carrying when I started the book, and thank God for that. But forgiveness also is one of those things that forgiveness doesn't mean that we forget, and it doesn't mean that that the pains that we may be carrying as a result of whatever the harm was don't exist. It just means that I choose grace, and I don't mean cheap grace. Cheap grace is like the type of shit where people say, they keep harming you, and it's like black people in America, like white, Like that's whenever, let me veer a bit, but whenever I think about cheap grace, I think about black people, how we're expected to forgive so much. And I'm like, Wayne burned this damn country down yet? Like, we have every right to. No, the grace is us suspending our rage and that this country can still exist in the way that it does, right? So for me, like, forgiveness does not necessarily mean that we sort of exercise cheap grace. It means that we hold people accountable. But particularly when it comes to black folk, I am not interested in disposing of us. You know why? Because I know what the world is ready to do with us anyway. And that's why I forgive. Like, and I'm getting older. My dad done died at 55. I'm watching people in my life go too soon. Why? I'm not carrying those weights with me to another plane. I just refuse to. So that's my simple response to it. Thank you.
These last two.
Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciated this conversation. I was just wondering, so much of what you've said here tonight had to do with sort of not viewing blackness through a sort of monolithic lens, right? So much of what you've talked about is how you've had to sort of deal with so many different walks of life and your different identities, but all like at the same time while being a black man. And so curious, you mentioned your apprehension to, be involved with politics personally, but that you're still very much involved in many different ways. I was curious as to how you view sort of black folks and their ability to participate in the political process in this country today, and how our different identities and our different experiences shape who we are as black people, and how that makes us feel in terms of how we can connect to like this democracy, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'll try to. So I believe that we need to apply different tactics and strategies to build a type of liberatory future where people are free to be their full human self without the threat of their well-being being diminished, where they can dream, and sort of not have to grow up in a world where they're taught to be laborers for the sake of a corporate class or for the sake of production purposes and labor purposes. But imagine what it might mean for young people to be asked what it is that they love, and how they might be positioned to go out and do what they love, as opposed to what it is that you want to do, which is really about asking them how they want to make money. All that to say, I can go on and on about a type of world that I think is free, one that doesn't use jail cells as a means to rehabilitate or manage problems. I support, but we need different tactics and strategies to get there. There are folk who I support who take a sort of apolitical posture, who see the state itself as the problem, and I understand why. Right? I get it. And then there are folk who sometimes are described as incrementalist, who understand or feel as if the state can be reformed, that the state's mechanism, the sort of institutions of the state can be reformed, and then there are some who I think go in and stay in, having a really progressive vision for what that could be, and survive that fire. Some people always don't. I can think of some very specific examples. Sometimes when you walk, I'm thinking about the Newark races, like with Raz Baraka, who I know. Raz is very, very progressive, has always been, and comes from a very progressive family, who I think learned really quickly how one's progressive vision can be shape-shifted even, within the context of electoral politics and within municipal leadership. Does that make sense? So even if you went in there saying, we about to get free, wait a minute. Sometimes when you get in a position, you're like, oh, before we get free, I got to go do this thing with this corporation over here who wants to build this housing complex.
I got to balance this budget.
So, but Raz, I'm using Raz as an example, and I can think of other places like Jackson, Mississippi, when you can create a groundswell of people, then a constituency that can give you the fire that you need to get it done, you can damn sure get it done. So I am for a range of the uses of different tactics and strategies that we can employ together never alone, for the purpose of freedom and liberation, for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone so much for coming. The last thing I'll say is that if I can look half as good as Darnell does when I'm 42, then I will have lived a good life. But thank you all so much for coming. Give it up to Darnell.
Thank you all.